Hi, everybody. I'm Sean. As has been noted, this is what's standing between you and the pizza. For that, I'm sorry. So this is me. I work for a company called Equal Experts. We are an Agile consulting company. We're one of the fastest growing Agile consulting companies in the UK. We're one of the fastest growing technology companies in the UK, period. As you can guess, yes, we're hiring too. This is how you get in touch with me. And this is my talk, which is about, as I said, we do a lot of Agile software development. And this is sort of my story and talk about how we do Agile software development and interface with operations. So, I'm not an ops, I'm a dev. There's a note in my speaker slides here that says pause for booze. You guys are a bit nicer than I thought. So, I'm not in operations, I don't provide full-time support, I don't take part in a call schedule, but I have a lot of respect for people that do. And in a way, I'd like to think that this is helpful because when a developer says developers don't treat operations people well enough, maybe that counts more. And we don't. And even in a nice, modern, full-featured, sort of really trendy, hipster Agile shop, developers often neglect their operations brethren just a little bit. Here's sort of the traditional way that people develop your average application, Agile or otherwise. Well, actually, just Agile. You get a backlog of features. Everybody agrees on what the backlog is. It changes all the time. You develop them, you test them, and then comes the magical phrase where you just throw it over the wall and operations handles it. And if you ask developers how they build any of this for manageability or maintaining it in production or anything, well, developers are human beings, and human beings do certain sorts of things in these situations. And generally, they'll do one of three things. They'll go with what they did before, or what's readily available to them as a solution. Well, we'll manage it with X because X is just right here, and we can get it set up, and something is better than nothing. This is something, therefore, this is what we must do. They build what they would like to have in their perfect world, forgetting that they are not you, and they have slightly different skill sets and often wildly different perspectives. In particular, most developers only ever develop one application at a time. Many operations staff maintain a great many more than one application at a time, 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or, what was it, 800 plus, developed by 800 different teams with 800 different technology stacks and 800 different points of views, and that's something that developers often forget. In their world, there's just one, so of course it works this way because everything I've written for the last year works this way. Heck, half the time they guess. And they don't guess to be mean, they guess because you're not there, or they guess because they can't get a hold of you and they're trying to guess what you want. What I've seen a lot is that when faced with something like this, operations people do, again, what people do. They try and make it work. They'll sift through what's there. Detective work happens a lot of times. I've had a client where the operations and deployment team sort of looked through stuff that the people got and sort of said, well, we think they're doing this and we think we're doing that. And they didn't really configure it the way we wanted to do for production, so we sort of opened up what they did, we reconfigured a little bit, we fixed this bug, and we repackage it entirely and send it on out. And developers hate that, of course. I'm not really sure anybody's actually ever happy to do that. A textbook example that actually happened to me 2 weeks ago. Running some kit where we have to script interaction with Apache Solar. And so we're running a virtual machine, and as part of our infrastructure, we have to, when we're creating the virtual machine from scratch, we have to start Solar, wait for it to say that it started, and then do some stuff with it. And we had to figure out, well, how do we know when it started? And we found this sort of random log line that goes jetty.server.server started and a timestamp, and so we wrote this sort of horrible regex that looks for exactly that line, and if they ever change that line, we're totally screwed. And that happens a lot. I bet you people do that all over the place because it's just sort of, we found the thing that it's close enough and it's the best we're gonna get, and we don't have time to go in and fix it, so we'll just matter, or we'll just make it work. But I want to go back to this pattern of throw it over the wall. The phrase throw it over the wall isn't just not what you want to do. I believe it's actually, honestly, toxic, downright toxic to relationships between people that deep down should be on the same team. Because developers just throw it over the wall, you're catching what is at best a hot potato, and you've got to do something with it. And the natural response is to go, look, we're trying to make this work. We need to do certain things to put it live. We can't put it live until we do those things. And developers, in turn, will see that as a release gate. And it can't go live until it makes it through this gate. And developers see that as an impediment to release. And the more agile you are, almost the worse it is, because agile developers attack impediments like they're, I don't know, invading barbarians or something. They root around them, they just try and avoid them. And so what happens is, as soon as you have operations people putting up what's perceived as a barrier to release, and then developers doing whatever they can to get around barriers to release, you get a just absolute spiral of mistrust is actually sort of the nicest way to describe it. Worse, you get hacks. You get situations like I had with a client that will not be named, that since there were barriers to development because of quality, they sort of had what's called big releases and little releases, where with big releases you could release code, but with little releases you could release configuration changes. And all of a sudden, more and more and more functionality went into the configuration changes, and then you ended up with sort of an application that had a kernel of actual sort of feature, and then everything was just driven off of config files, and those config files could be modified by people in the marketing department. And if you think developers do a bad job creating applications that can be maintained in runtime, wait till you're maintaining an application that's been written by marketing. You'll want to kill yourself just after you've killed them. The best possible outcome in these kind of cases is you end up with a culture of negotiation between developers and operations as opposed to collaboration. And even that is not very good, and it can get so much worse than that. What do we do instead? As I already said, we want to foster a culture of collaboration, not negotiation. And the big secret, it's not a big secret. Developers want this too. They really, really do. Some don't know it yet. But the smart ones do. And developers, speaking as a developer, we want to collaborate with operations. We want a healthy working relationship with operations because we want to release software. And the more agile you are, the more often you want to release software. We want to release software now, and we want to release lots of it. And it feels good for that to happen, and we want it to work once it's released. And so if the best way for that to happen is to work well with everybody. And so if it's done in a way where we can be happy with sort of the quality as well, and we can feel like equal partners in it, and we don't feel like we're being dictated to, developers will really, really be happy to collaborate. But how? So treat operations people as users. And by that I mean treat operations people as users within the context of the Agile user story. Who here works in a way that they would say is Agile? Show of hands. Okay, fair bit. Who here is familiar with the concept of a user story? Okay, so about half of everybody. So a garden variety user story is usually feature-based. And it would be something like, as a user, I would like the login link to be on the main page at the top instead of at the bottom so that I can figure out where it is I have to log in when I've come back from the site for a while and it's easier for me to log in. Something like that. They're tied to sort of tangible user benefits. And there's a bunch of discussion that happens a lot of the time. You may hear it mentioned under the topic of there's no such thing as a non-functional requirement. And the idea is there's no such thing as a non-functional requirement because there's lots of different users, and it's actually a functional requirement for a different user. It's not, I want to be notified when the app crashes as a non-functional requirement. It's, as an operations person, I want to be able to be conveniently notified when the app crashes so that I can get my bat and find whoever wrote a memory leak and make them not do it anymore. Fine. So that happens a lot. But the key thing is that operations aren't just users. They're probably the most important users. And the reason I say this is because if you write a web application, your operations team are the only people in the whole wide world who actually turn your application on. I mean, if you write Microsoft Word, everybody turns your application on, but in the web world, the operations staff turn your application on. And you guys do a hell of a lot more besides that. But if the application doesn't start in the first place, it doesn't earn any money. So that's enough. The big thing that a lot of people don't do is that when they think of operations staff as being users, it really only matters in the prioritization phase of Agile. You know, we need to do these stories for operations because they're users. Or you can put the operations stories beside the make the user interface pretty stories because they're all features for users and the product owner can sort out what's more important. I think that the next step is actually, and what we've seen, the step is to involve them as users, involve you guys as users for more than that. Not just story creation, but story acceptance. So, when you're developing for an operations team, the operations team should be involved in writing the stories in the first place. Should be involved in testing the stories. Stories involving operations should be demoed to somebody from operations before they go live, which sounds like a really obvious thing. But who here has been involved in any sort of Agile thing where a feature for monitoring or managing an application has actually been demoed to you as a DevOps person before it went live? Show of hands. That's what, 3, 4 lonely hands? So, I mean, it happens occasionally. It should happen a lot. It should happen all the time. If the stories, I don't know, page me when the application crashes, you should see that demoed to you from, you know, bumper to bumper before it goes live. You shouldn't see that the first time live. You should see it ahead of time so that you can know, I don't know, it doesn't have the right information in the text message, or, oh, it chops off the URL halfway, or any old thing. Most importantly, the people that the story is for need to be involved in deciding that the story is done. Straightforward. So we've done this a few times, and there's one case study that just became a personal favorite of mine, mostly because I got to write some neat code, but just because it stuck out the most. And so this has happened to me on 3 different occasions with 2 different clients now, and it's just logging. So if you ask developers, what do you need to log in production this application that you're writing? What are the features you need? They usually come back with a bunch of crap like this. You want to be able to dynamically change the logging levels in production. We want to start with a low amount of logging. We need to tune it up and write a high amount of logging. And there is, in that statement, the magical presupposition that whatever they add later on will be exactly what's needed to solve the problem, which is probably not true, because if it was, you just leave it on in the first place. And you don't know what the problem is yet. But they also want to be able to dynamically change formats. They want to be able to log to a text file sometimes and a SQL database some other time. And they also want to be able to log to console. And they want it to be highly configurable. And this is a classic example of what I was saying before, developers using what's around. Developers, I swear, tend to think that this is what you need because this is what a lot of platforms and frameworks just offer. And the reason they offer that, I did some research, is because there was a project, an IBM development project, that started in 1999 that wrote a framework that worked this way because there wasn't anything around. And the Java platform at a time. And everyone else since, as far as I can tell, is just using it because it was based on something that was based on something else that was based on something else that used this pattern. The key thing about this pattern is that this pattern is highly developer-centric. When you look at the original documentation, the idea was to allow developers to debug the application that they had written. It wasn't written to allow people from operations to maintain it in production. It was 1999. No one was even using web apps yet. This was designed for probably GUI applications, emitting engineering debugging in the back end or something. So when we asked operations personnel what they wanted in logging, we got, as you can imagine, a completely different list of requirements. The number one, I'm sure most of you would get this immediately. What's everything it's going to log? What are all the things I can possibly see? When am I going to see them? What should I do when I see them? And there's a completely different list of presuppositions built in here. A list of all the messages that can be logged. implies, and when implies that it's tested that this happens. I want to be able to guarantee that this is occurring. Yes, I am that kind of guy. I unit test my logging statements. Don't judge. Know what every action you're going to take for every message implies that if you're not going to take an action, why are you logging the message in the first place? Sometimes you want to. Auditing, fraud prevention are two common reasons, but it's fewer and far between. You don't just log something because, why not, or it makes me feel better. It's, what would someone do if they got this? Because you guys are probably far more aware than my particular half of the tribe that if you get a log message you've never seen before on your pager at 3:45 in the morning, you got to figure out what to do about it. And if the answer is nothing, that was a waste of your time. Because I value everybody in operations, I value your time, and I don't want someone to send you crap logging messages at 3:45 in the morning. They need to be easy to parse. This is the center of management by automation. Automation means parsing. Parsing means predictability. Even just little things like when you're working in Java land, who here has seen a log file and tried to parse or read a log file that had two threads writing a stack trace into the same file at the same time? It's like there's a special circle of hell for people who are stuck in that situation. Line by line, sort of like copying the first line over here and the second line over there, and maybe you can script it and there's some random other line in the middle of that crap. It's just horrible. And we use tools these days, right? So log rotate, elk stack, anything like that. It's just going to go into the file. Then the usual tools that you guys use for everything else all the time should take it from there. Doing too much is almost worse than not doing anything. Java logging frameworks have this wonderful magical property that they rotate their log files, and if you do it for them, they blow up and just write to the old file, and you can't compress the file and you lose data. And they do things like, you can dynamically change the logging level in production. Except we just had a really nice talk about Docker, and you don't touch production configurations ever because we use idempotent production server configurations now. So this is all stuff like there's features here that you actively don't need and features that actively cause problems. And I swear it's because no one just asked you what you wanted. So when we had started a really big conversation and requirements gathering change with our users, our operational users, the biggest difference was that one story became many stories. And it was amazing to me that it did this sort of 3 times, and it happened almost exactly the same way each time. When you leave it up to developers, the story is, we should add logging. And this is kind of an impossible user story. Because what logging are you going to add? Well, whatever we need, right? What's it going to look like? The usual sort of thing. This is pretty much guaranteed to be the kind of story that happens at the end. And really what's going to happen is someone's going to work on it until they run out of time and everything has to go live, and then they're going to stop. When you actually talk to operations people as a developer and say, you're going to maintain this in production, what do you need to do that? Stories look totally different. They look like, we need to log a message when the application starts. When something completely unexpected goes wrong, we need to log, and you better include a stack trace because I'm going to give it to you and tell you and ask you to help me figure it out. When an import job completes, I want a message, and I want the ID of the job in the story. These stories are starting to look like they've got acceptance criteria. They're specific. Some of them can be done in an hour, which is really good. They can be scheduled separately, independently. You know how it's now possible to tell how far along the process of instrumenting the application to work in production are you. And this doesn't just work with logging. This works with anything you want to do monitoring-wise. Alarms, load balancing, the works. But when the users get to write the stories or get involved in the writing of stories, and sometimes you need help, sometimes you need coaching. Regular users are like that too. That's fine. But as soon as you start doing that and have the conversation, it becomes so much easier for the product manager to manage the backlog of features for monitoring and infrastructure and maintenance the same way that they manage the rest of the stuff, and it can actually manage it like it's sort of a portfolio of requirements as opposed to what always happens, we got to make it work in production. And enterprise customers are the absolute worst for this because they just run out of time. And so it's incredibly different. And we found it was so different that by the time we're done, we wanted an entirely different tool in the library to do this. Imagine that. come up with an entirely different set of requirements, you end up with an entirely different answer. And the first time we built it, fair enough. Second time we built it, fine. The third time we built it, we were working for the government, project GDS, and they have a requirement that they open source everything. So we took what we had done there, and we actually built the tool we wanted to have. And so I will now show you really quickly, because I am standing between you and pizza, kind of how it looks and how it looks different. And the first thing I'm going to have to do is do this backwards and zoom in. So the big difference, I don't know if anybody's seen log statements before, but it's usually a message like log, and it takes a string. And the problem with that is those strings can be anywhere in the whole application, which means that the number one feature, what's everything that can possibly be logged, is just really difficult to do. And as a result, we just don't tell you. And if we say we do, we're probably lying. But here, the difference is we came up with a pattern where there's an enumeration of all the possible messages. So where are all the messages the application can log? Well, it's easy. It's right here. We wanted them to be easy to parse. And this book, Release It, by a guy named Michael Nygaard, this is like 15 years old, still one of the best books I've ever written in software development, had the idea, just have a code. Each message has a unique code, and we provide test support for this so that when you have your enumeration, we can actually run tests against it. There will be a unit test that fails if these codes aren't unique. And then we just have a little format string. So you got your message, you've got a format string, and when you actually, how the heck does this work? When you actually go to the class that logs, you actually just call log with the message, and the arguments gets passed in, goes out, and it writes to a file, just a file. You want to do something else? That's what the elk stack's for. It's perfect at that anyways. The other thing we do is we have strong support for tools like log rotate, because in order to make sure that the files can be rotated at any time, we're really good about dropping locks, picking up locks, so that you can rotate the files in the middle of everything. It will not break. I am probably running a bit short on time. If anybody wants to see more about this, come show me after. We do really crazy cool things with stack traces. We will never, ever, ever mangle a stack trace. We buffer it into memory and then write it. We do more besides. Sorry, I am trying to get back to my presentation. Hold on a sec here. There we go. So I am basically finished. That's what we built, and it was one of the most fun software side projects I've done in a long time, because it felt like it was solving a real problem. It felt like it was really production-oriented. It felt like it was helping in some small way to make someone's 2 in the morning just a little bit better. So basically done. Parting thoughts. As we discussed, there are no non-functional requirements. Everything is benefiting some sort of user somewhere, even load testing. As 100,000 separate users, I want the site not to blow up when we all visit it on Christmas Day. But operators are users. Operators are the most important users. As operators, try and push to be involved in the acceptance process for the parts of the application that are there for you to manage them. Be involved in the life cycle of that. If you do your part to foster collaboration and not negotiation, I swear we will too. Remind your developers that a lot has changed in 15 years, and they shouldn't use last decade's libraries to solve this decade's problems and challenges. And please, for the love of all that is holy, don't let your developers get away with the sin of thinking that operations is exactly like development, because we all know it's not. Thanks very much.